Well, Bill Brown, we're sitting here at last. I know that you know that for a long time I've been eager to get you in front of the cameras and have a chance to sit uninterrupted with you to get a chance to talk about you and your life and your views about dentistry and dental education. And so I think we might begin by just taking a look at today from your perspective. I've really been one of the people who has seen the rapid emergence of dental education since the 1960s, and where there's been a rapid enlargement of dental school enrollments and numbers of dental schools, and actually being part of that process. And if you were to take a look at dental education right today, how would you view that scene? What does it look like to you?
Well, I think we're in a period of transition, and I'm not hearing too many prognosticators out there telling us really where we're at or where we're headed. The changes since the mid-60s have been enormous. I think back to my old school, Michigan, with its antiquated equipment, antiquated building, which was in service until 1970. And that means using equipment that basically was 1905 vintage. And what's happened, it seems to me, in the last 20 years, it's got an awful lot bigger, it's got an awful lot more expensive, and it's also got a great deal better. And I think in the long term, the quality of patient care is going to improve just enormously. I think back to the 1960s, I guess we were still using compound and copper band impression material. I think we're still using gold 3/4 crowns for fractured incisors with a silicate window. I mean, you talk about archaic. It's just incredible how far we've come. And one of the things that I guess my years on the Commission on Dental Accreditation we talked about was trying to do more to correlate the basic and the clinical sciences. The two were pretty well split. But I think today they're fairly well meshed, and perhaps because of the AIDS issue, we've now been forced to get really practical about microbiology, immunology, sterilization, doing things that we, I guess, knew we ought to be doing for many, many years, but it's really brought some of those things into the real world. But I think dental education in 1988 is going through some very difficult times. Clearly the applicant pool, which is continuing to erode, the concern, I think, on the parts of many university presidents and legislators and governors about the cost of a dental education, the enormous tuition at private schools particularly, but you can see it growing in public schools too. Are we pricing ourselves out of the market? Are the taxpayers getting their money's worth? Well, I happen to think they are. But I do worry about pricing ourselves out of the market. So I think we're in some fairly stiff times right now. And I don't pretend to know quite where we're headed, but it's sure going to be fun to watch.
I know you've been involved for, I guess, the longest time in development of the Future of Dentistry report, curriculum change conferences, all of a whole range of things that are looking to respond to the change. Bill, what's your sense in terms of the kinds of prescriptions that dentistry needs right now?
We need to have a fair number of bright minds who are willing to stick their necks out and do what they think is right. It seems to me that dental faculty and dental administrators are just about like people in any other walk of life. They're normally content with the way things are. They don't particularly want to ripple the waters. There are lots of stresses out there, and I think there's a fair amount of fear, and people just don't want to take that big step that perhaps will launch us into the year 2000. I think there's a great deal of timidity, and I see it at the organizational levels. I see it in dental education, and I guess we need more leaders, and I hope we can find them. But now, in my opinion, is not a time to be afraid or fearful. It's time to be very wise, not do dumb things, not change just for the sake of changing it, but we need some people who can really make the system go, and I'm not sure I see that many out there. I get, requests for candidates for deanships regularly. And I admit to you, it's difficult for me to come up with more than 2 or 3 names that I feel comfortable in recommending. And that's sort of too bad. And maybe dental education, or maybe education hasn't done well enough to develop that leadership system.
Bill, stick your neck out for me.
Sure, I don't mind.
And if you were to take a look at maybe some of the hard choices that need to be made, or the kinds of risks dentistry needs to be involved in, where would they be?
Well, I think dentistry has turned away from, not entirely, but I think it's turned away in part from some of its social responsibilities. I think of the Hillenbrand years, the years that I knew him during the 60s particularly, where the American Dental Association was moving the Congress, was moving the organization, was developing programs that were going to look after the people out there, that was going to, I think, really capitalize on the basic responsibilities of a health profession, and that's to look after the folks. And I think we've turned from that. And it seems to me that we're always trying to protect ourselves now, protect ourselves from AIDS patients, protect ourselves from perhaps the anesthetic deaths. And it seems to me we've turned too much inward. And I see that perhaps pervading the educational system as well as the organizational system. I just don't hear that much about dentistry moving the system to benefit the folks anymore. And that's where I see the greatest need. I don't know, I don't think I'm that different from anybody else, but when I started in the mid-40s and started to practice, I admit to you that I didn't know how much money I was going to make. I wasn't that much concerned about paying the rent or buying a car. I was concerned about looking after people because that was how I got brought up. And I think we've turned away from that, and I don't think dentistry is perhaps any different than society generally, but awful lot of inward looking today, and I really think we've lost something.
It reminds me of a talk that you gave in June '85 in I believe it was in Michigan, when you talked about the Hillenbrand era and the post-Hillenbrand era, and I wonder if you could just sort of elaborate some more on that.
Well, I got hooked into organized dentistry, I guess, late 50s, so I was able to follow the Hillenbrand era for about 10 years. A very forceful man. He'd been the executive director of the American Dental Association for over 20 years, and he ran it. He was the spokesman. He was the person who talked to the Congress. Everybody knew him. He had creative thoughts. He was always looking out for the folks out in the street and trying to make their lot better, and to make dentistry's lot better as well. Then the Hillenbrand era ended in 1968, as I recall. And since that time, there have been 3 successors to him. One whose tour of duty, I guess his first successor, was relatively brief and stormy. But the system changed. Instead of that person being the real leader and the person who spoke for the profession, that leadership was diminished. So it was the president of the American Dental Association or the Board of Trustees, and I literally saw that executive officer stifled. I recall a speech he gave to the American College of Dentists that I thought was marvelous, creative, forward-thinking. He caught great flack for it, I presume, because it was a little bit too liberal for some of the folks, and he was told, just don't do that anymore.
You're referring to Watson?
I'm referring to Watson, yeah. That was a tragic story because he and I were good friends, and he developed Alzheimer's disease during his tour of duty as the executive officer, and the trustees looked upon it as incompetence, and it was not diagnosed until after he was essentially terminated. And of course, you know, he recently passed away from Alzheimer's. Very tragic story and a very marvelous person. But basically, the executive officer today is someone who directs the traffic, in my opinion, and does what he's told to do. And this is an enormous change from the Hillenbrand years. And maybe that's for the better, I don't know. But I think it's taken away much of the leadership that the profession enjoyed for at least the last 10 or 15 years of Hillenbrand's career.
That's an interesting perspective. And do you feel that it's too early now in Ginley's years as executive director to speak about what sort of leadership he's going to be providing?
It probably is. He and I are very close friends. I can think of no one who could do that job any better than he could do it. I recall somebody called and asked if I would like to be a candidate for that job. I said, no, there's only one candidate, and that's Tom Ginley, and I can tell you right now, he'll be the person you select, and he should have been. He's a marvelous person, very intelligent man, very thoughtful, very personable, but there's a different system working up there now, and I think he is being cautious and perhaps restrained in how he can manage the system. It's different.
Where do you think the new leadership is going to come from, Bill, and you know, are there ways that we can begin to promote that?
Interesting question. No quick fix, no easy answer. It's a difficult, leadership is very difficult. One doesn't start out, I guess, by saying, I'm going to be a leader, or I'm going to be president of the American Dental Association, or I'm going to be a dean, or I'm going to be a president, or I'm going to be something. That somehow the system doesn't work that way. And I think maybe during my growing up years, people were a little more content to do what needed to be done and to develop a history and to build on their background and to do things that were perhaps done reasonably well with some creativity. And then eventually the people I can recall developed into leadership positions, but it just sort of happened and they were selected. Clearly there's never been a time in our history when leadership was something that was came about through any kind of a training program. I'm not sure it comes through special courses in administration or business or whatever else. It seems to me that's maybe one of the things you're either born to do or you're not. And a lot of leaders have trouble getting themselves into positions where they can exert that kind of responsibility. And I think that's one of the reasons that I came to Oklahoma, because it was to start something new, and I felt at least for a while I could do it my way and make some of my ideas come to fruition, and I think that's happened. But those opportunities clearly have diminished a great deal and are not likely to recur for probably many, many years yet to come. And it's tough for that young person to ripple the waters, go out and do things that are different without being trod on. And I'm not sure there is a system, but it seems to me it's something that is worthy of some people talking about and perhaps trying to create a system where we could get more of the folks out there and have them step up front. Because traditionally, the leadership in the professions has come about either through rather unusual skills, leadership qualities that just can't be denied and the person makes it, or it's the guy who's been around the longest who gets the ticket to do it, and the guys who've been around the longest all too often are the guys who forgot all about being a leader, or decide all of a sudden, okay, I'll become a trustee to run for president. And normally you don't really provide the leadership when you're running for office because you don't want to displease anybody.
Earlier, there was an interview with Dr. Roop, and he talked about dentistry 20 years from now, and he said, well, he didn't think it was going to change that much. What's your sense, Bill? Is dentistry 20 years from now going to continue through what appears to be some major transitions?
It's undergone such an enormous change in the past 20 years. I guess it's hard to foresee that we can change that much in the next 20, but I wouldn't hold my breath. My sense is that 20 years from now we'll have changed perhaps as much as we've changed in the past 20. Changes have just been enormous, but think of the things yet we really haven't solved. Much of what we do is very imperfect and is pretty subjective, and we do because we've always done it that way. Until a few years ago, we didn't have an awful lot of respect for the soft tissues in the mouth. We just sort of took care of the teeth, and we didn't worry about what surrounded them. But my word, in the last 10 to 15 years, of course, we've accomplished a great deal, and we're much more concerned about it, and I think do an infinitely better job. I remember my graduate training in terms of placing margins of restorations. With children particularly, it was to get them up underneath the gingival tissue as far as we could, because those teeth were going to continue to erupt and expose those margins eventually. And the damage that we did back in those days, just incredible. But the TMJ syndrome, the oral facial pain, occlusion, I think we have so far to go before we come close to solving that problem. The management of periodontal disease is for the few who, I guess, have the motivation and the perhaps resources to handle it. But we've got a lot to do yet, and I can't believe that we aren't going to make as big changes over these next few years as we made before, but I don't know what they're going to be. Clearly, implantology is going to be much more in favor than it was 5 or 10 years ago. But science is being used now instead of simply anecdotal information about patients. And we've finally got something to build on. But I don't think there's still enough science in dentistry. Sure, our students get courses in biostatistics, but it seems to me they forget an awful lot about that once they get out into practice and are hooked into many slick-talking salesmen and buy into the wrong things. But dentistry has got to be more and more science. I would think, over the next 10 years or so, perhaps many, maybe most dental offices will have computer terminals hooked into a mainframe someplace so that they can tap into it every morning and learn the latest on whatever there is out there. I think 20 years from now, it's going to be a lot different than it is.
If you had the opportunity right now, let's see, you came to Oklahoma in 1970?
1969.
69. If you had the opportunity today, such as you had in 69, you're coming to a brand new place, no curriculum, no faculty, almost no building, what would you build today?
Different from what we attempted to build almost 20 years ago?
Well, just given your sense in terms of where dentistry is now and where it's going, how would the dental school look different?
I'd probably, well, I have to back up a second, because when we started, we were coming to a state that had a relatively few number of dentists, and it was critical at that time to develop a core of dentists who would be very skilled generalists who could go anywhere in the state, the smallest community, and practice without the need for a battery of specialists standing around them. And I think we did that pretty well. That was one of our primary objectives. And we took a number of the skills that really had been pretty much limited to specialists at that time and plugged them into our pre-doctoral curriculum. One of the things that I wanted to do was to see a strong pre-doctoral orthodontic program, which most schools had one way or another avoided, because at least 20 years ago there was a lot of damage being done, I thought, out there. There are an awful lot of short courses on orthodontics for the general practitioners, and there were a lot of people doing things that they weren't prepared to do. Now, I'm not saying that that's all been solved, but I think it's a lot better than it used to be. So we wanted to really prepare our people to go out and look after the folks any place in the state. Now today, given what's happened, the numbers of dentists have increased, the public is more sophisticated, I suppose. I probably would today move more directly into a research component, because we did not develop that. It's only been recently. I think our students should be plugged in today into opportunities for research and learning science. And I think we do much more in terms of faculty development today than we did back then. And the one thing that we tried to do, but I still think we haven't made it yet, is to do a better job of making dental students enjoy what they're doing. You know, ever since I started dental school, beefs about the curriculum, beefs about faculty-student relationships, they've existed as long as, I guess, dental education has existed. And I take the position that in almost no other educational program is a student being critiqued for what he or she does rather than what he knows. But you know, faculty are standing over students criticizing millimicrons of work that they do, and this goes on day after day, hour after hour, and most of it get pretty tired of it. And I imagine you even might have gotten tired of it occasionally. I know I got tired of it, and I learned how to avoid those faculty who made life miserable for me. But it's sort of generic to the system. And we still don't have relationships, it seems to me, between faculty and students that are as comfortable as I would like to see them. No question that we could do a lot better with that area, and I think we'd have many, many more very, very comfortable, happy alumni out there willing to support dental education. And when we recruited faculty, we talked to each one of them about the cruciality of good faculty-student relations. And they're a lot better than they used to be, a lot better than they used to be. But in my judgment, they're still not good enough.
Would you organize the school the same way? Is the departmental structure that we've got the one that you'd adopt?
Well, I probably would. There would be some minor variations because there's some inequities, but what we wanted to do, we wanted to attract good people to come here, so we had to do some things that would make them want to come to Oklahoma. And one of the things to attract good people, of course, is to make departments and departmental chairs available to them. And there's no question that a number of the very strong people that we got came here because they could chair a department, they could organize a program, they could do it the way they thought it should be done, and it just gave them a marvelous opportunity, a one chance in a lifetime. Then at the same time, I wanted to have departments that would sort of relate to each other, so we clustered departments into divisions so that they would talk to each other, meet periodically, and then we placed our faculty offices so departments were clustered together and divisions were clustered together. And I think that has been a big advantage to the system. At the same time, we have some divisions that are terribly small, others that are large, and in terms of democracy, I suppose there's some inequities, and I think if it could be restructured and take out some of those inequities, the system is not too bad.
One hears that there's a need to bring dentistry closer into the mainstream of healthcare delivery. I've heard talk about the concerns about the isolation of dentistry, that it tends to sit apart from the Health Sciences Center. What's your sense of that, Bill?
Well, I think the isolation is one of the major faults with the way the system works today. But I'm not quite sure how to correct it. Bringing it into hospitals, bringing dental practices into hospitals was pretty hot stuff, what, 15, 20 years ago? And we saw departments develop in some hospitals, particularly I think on the East Coast. Fewer perhaps as you move from the East to the Midwest to the far West. But this isolationism, this being alone and being out of the mainstream, oh, I think it's devastating. I guess that's why we have dental meetings, so dentists can talk to each other. And it's one of the reasons perhaps that dental faculty don't like to go to dental meetings, because they're together all the time with somebody else and they're working the new territories. They know pretty well what's going on. And to go to a dental meeting and listen to things that are pretty much what they've already heard, it's not real exciting. And I think that's one of the things that I have faulted myself and perhaps our faculty on. We have not been as good attenders as we should, and it's just a responsibility, it seems to me, being in dental education, to participate with that practicing community. Because where I grew up, one without the other isn't going to cut it. And dental practice by itself is really not going to make it. Dental education by itself is not really going to make it. The two have got to walk together, and walk together, it seems to me, just almost every step of the way. But with what's happening to hospitals today, with some of the crises in medicine and among physicians, and the growing discomfort, it seems to me, with cost containment, I'm not sure this is a good time for dentistry to be moving in that direction. I'm not quite sure what the solution to that one is. We'll ask you, will dentistry become a specialty of medicine someday? I don't know the answer to it. Should it be? I don't know the answer to it. I'm not sure. With what's happening in medicine today, maybe dentistry is a lot better being removed from it, at least for the time being. You know, medicine and nursing have basically split. And, well, I'll tell you, nurses out there are leaving the profession. There are many troubles getting enough applicants to nursing school these days. But physicians and nurses, 25 years ago, for whatever reasons, pretty much split apart. And I can see the same thing happening between dentistry and dental hygiene if we're not careful. There are a lot of political forces out there that would tend to keep pulling them apart. I think that'd be a tragedy.
I want to read just, I think that issue of dental hygiene is an interesting one, and I wanted to just read to you from one of the things that you wrote in terms of some predictions that you were making as it related to dental hygiene. And I'm just wondering, this dates back to 1985, and I'm just sort of wondering whether or not this still holds true. This was from a talk that you gave at the University of Michigan, and it had to do with practice prediction as it relates to hygiene. And you said eventually most, if not all, states will revise their statutes concerning supervision so that hygienists have the freedom to practice in hospitals, rehab centers, nursing homes, schools, corporations. They could become field triage agents for persons without regular dental care and stimulate an increase in the demand for care. What's your sense about that bill now? Is that still seem among some likely predictions?
I still think it's right. When it's going to come about, I'm not quite sure. I think that there are close to 35 states that, in their Dental Practice Act, permit dental hygienists to practice without the direct supervision of the dentist being right there at the time. Oklahoma's been going through that issue for, I'd say, the last 5 or 6 years. There was some activity this year to get the Practice Act changed to permit general supervision, but it never got out of committee, and I'm not sure it will get out of committee for a few years. It's a complicated issue, and it's not related simply to general supervision. It's a male-female issue. It's an issue of females who are usually quite intelligent, who've had a good educational program, wanting to expand their horizons, make more money, get better fringe benefits, be able to practice what they've been taught without being restricted to, let's say, a 30-minute prophylaxis. It's very normal for a group of bright people to want to expand their horizons. And dentistry right now is holding them back. Dentists, dental hygiene, personal relations, I think, are still very strong, but organizationally they're anything but comfortable. The American Dental Association says that the objective of the American Dental Hygienists Association is to develop independent practice so that all dental hygienists have the opportunity to practice independently. My personal opinion is that that's not the way to go, and I've never espoused that theory, but I have some very close familial relations to hygienists, and I think I understand them, and I think I have a pretty good idea where they generally want to go, and independent practice is not what I'm listening to. But they would like a few more freedoms to grow and to get intellectually a little more stimulated. And eventually, in my judgment, they will get there. And I think what I said in '85 will one day come to pass. But right now, it's a very hot political issue. And if I were sitting here talking to you as dean of the college and speaking this way, the Oklahoma Dental Association would be on my back. In fact, they have been on my back for not fighting against the dental hygienists trying to seek general supervision. Our college never, the dental part of it has not actively taken a role in it, but our dental hygiene faculty 5 years ago were very active in trying to get legislation to permit general supervision. We've paid a very serious price for it.
Well, given the lesson of medicine and nursing, and as you pointed out just a little while ago, what could dentistry begin to do now to cement better relationships between dentists and dental hygienists on an organizational level?
Here again, I think, is where we've got to find the right leaders who are willing to sit down and negotiate. The hygienists want more freedom. They want to have broader horizons because, you know, doing what many hygienists do day after day after day, it gets a little bit old. They want to be able to do other things, and they have a number of skills, I think, that they can do. And in fact, back in the '60s, we were talking about a remarkable battery of additional functions for dental assistants and dental hygienists. And essentially, dental hygienists can be educated to do additional things beyond what they're doing right now. The American Dental Association has basically stonewalled the dental hygiene issue. They claim the dental hygienists are acting in bad faith, and the dental hygienists claim the Dental Association is acting in bad faith, and it's almost like kids in a sandpile. And in my judgment, and I'm not really taking sides, I think organizationally both of them have acted irresponsibly in many ways. Somebody on both sides of the coin is really going to have to get into the act and sit down and say, hey, this is the way we've got to go, and then somehow develop the networking system to make these things come to pass. Hygienists want more, and I can't blame them for wanting more. They're a group of very bright people who can do some things that they really are not being permitted to do today. But it's an arguable point, and I admit certainly in this region, it's probably not a very popular position to take, although I will say that a large group of dentists, particularly in the Tulsa area, I think would probably echo what I've said. And I've been working quite hard to see it happen. Part of it has to do with the economy in the state right now, and I think the bottom line is perhaps competition for dollars. and patients.
And that economic issue brings us back to a point that you made before, and that had to do with the decreasing applicant pool and the effect that's been having on dental education. Do you sense that turning around? I know you were part of the movement when there was a great expansion in numbers of school, number
Sure.
of students. Was that a mistake?
Not from my perspective. I, of course, wasn't really thinking about it back in those days, but I guess as we moved into the 70s, before we really reached the peak of applicants, I began to have some doubts about how far we were going to go, how far the system was expanding. If you compare the system in 1975 with the system in 1955, or even 1965, those 10 years expanded the system by 50%, 70%, an enormous amount. The system got increasingly more expensive, largely because of facilities that were far more complicated and much more costly to operate. Air conditioning in my old school was open windows, of course, and I think that was typical of the old schools in those days, but just handling, you know, the air conditioning of a building in Oklahoma is an enormous cost. Then we increased faculty. The right thing to do is to get more and more full-time faculty. So we increased faculty 10, 15, 20-fold, maybe more than that. And that, of course, increased the cost enormously. Today, we have a lot more dentists per population than we did in 1965. And it's hurt some dentists, no question about it. Has it hurt the public? And it seems to me those are two separate issues. Maybe they're not separate, but they're two issues. Until the 1970s, a dentist could essentially decide where he wanted to practice, go there, and be successful. And he could have been incompetent. Now, happily, I don't think there were that many incompetents, but he could have gone there and done just about whatever he wanted to do. Might have decided, well, I'm not going to take emergencies outside of office hours. My office hours will be for my convenience. I'm going to do it the way I want to because I've got a captured audience. Now, in 1988, well, before 1988, that has changed. Patients now have a choice. So, particularly the older dentists, and particularly those who have not been able to keep up as well as they might, and it's not easy for them to keep up, they're going to have more difficult times, I think, competing for patients, because the younger dentist comes out with a battery of skills that are far beyond what I learned, has enough sense, I think, to appeal to patients in terms of office hours, in terms of taking emergencies whenever it's required, and something I think more and more dentists are doing, are calling that patient in the evening after perhaps a difficult procedure that might have been difficult for the patient. Dentists are not being nice to people. I'll tell you, when I started out, I was about the only one I knew who was taking care of emergencies evenings and weekends, and that really bothered me because I thought that was part of our responsibility. But I think dentistry lost that when it had things pretty much its own way. But now patients have a choice. And what's happening, I think, either the people who have not, the dentists who have not stayed current, or are not doing so well by their patients, or perhaps patients don't like them for what they are. These are the people who are either going to drop off, not do as well, or they're going to have to make a commitment to go back and retread so that they can once again be competitive. You know, it's interesting because the American way has been essentially a competitive way. Person who can do it a little bit better, person who can make the better car, they're the ones who are going to make it. Now we've got dentists, for the first time in our history, who are competitive with one another. And I don't like all the ways the competition is being fostered, but patients now have a choice, and they can find the person they like, they can find the person whose fees they appreciate. They've just got all sorts of choices. So dentists are going to have to do things differently, and they are. But when I hear a father of a dental student tell me, I told my son he should never go into dentistry, sort of exemplifies, I think, a trend that is very bothersome. But now dentistry is part of the American way of life. for the first time in its history.
Well, let's take a look at two things that have come along with that, and I'm interested to hear your reaction. I think one of the things that we see with the increased competition has been the advertising.
No question.
And I think the second, possibly as a result of that dentist telling the son not to go into dentistry, is that the quality of the dental student appears to be going down.
Sure.
How does that result in terms of the public good?
Okay, I guess, you know, your question was, has the applicant pool declined, bottomed out? No, it hasn't. What's the future look like? We're not quite sure. The quality of dental students coming into the system today, based on all the data that are available, very little different than the quality coming in 10 years ago, and probably about equal to the quality of the student coming in the early 1960s, if you look at entering grade point averages and average dental aptitude test scores. When I was going to school, I would bet you that the quality of the student coming into the system was far less than it is today. We had 97 students start in my class. We graduated 60. We lost, my word, 50% plus of that poor little class. And I can tell you, there were some in there who weren't very good. I think overall the quality of the person coming into the profession has increased decade by decade. But of course we went through that period of the 1970s when we had 3 applicants for every first-year class position, and you could, you know, take your pick of the litter. It was a very unnatural period in our development. But today it's sort of back where I think we'd be if that big expansion period had not taken place. It's changed very little if you look at grade point and look at aptitude test scores. And if you deal with the students, I think the students today are every bit as good as any class of students that I've known in my whole experience, and perhaps better than they were 15 or 20 years ago. Current class of seniors across the street are just marvelous people. They're going to do very, very well. So I don't think there's been that much of a decline in the quality of students. At some institutions it perhaps is a little more difficult because, let's face it, at the high tuition schools, a student who can't afford it is perhaps going to look to a public institution at lower tuition, and that private school may well get what's left over, or it may well be a class with a high percentage of foreign students. So I would submit there are some schools where perhaps the quality, the credentials of the entering students could be substantially less. That's bothersome. But it's a function of largely cost.
What about the advertising?
Makes me bite my tongue periodically. Too much of it is gimmickry to get patients into a system. I don't have any particular problem with marketing practices by doing some of the things we were talking about, like convenient hours and being especially nice to patients. But as I look at the yellow pages and as I now see advertisements on television and radio, it's attracting patients too often for the wrong reasons. And when I was growing up, my father was very much involved, he was a dentist, very much involved in the advertising issue in the state of Michigan. There was a great deal of advertising, I guess largely in the major metropolitan areas, particularly Detroit. And a group of dentists got together, lobbied the legislature, and got the legislature to put in some fairly stiff changes in the Dental Practice Act to, for the most part, eliminate advertising. And will we come back to that point someday? It'll be a long time, because now the Supreme Court, of course, in its infinite wisdom, has permitted these things. And I don't think any jurisdiction yet has really determined what is truthful, reasonable, non-biased advertising. That decision hasn't been made. But I would submit that the average dentist who worries about patients being attracted to dentists for the wrong reasons probably gets upset periodically by some of the stuff that's coming down the pike. My guess is that advertising will go just about as far as they can go until somebody gets so upset that they're going to say, hey, now wait just a minute, this kind of stuff can't go on. I think it's a tough issue. And of course, for us older guys, it's uncomfortable. The extent of my advertising was about 2 inches of one column in the newspaper one time, announcing the opening of my office.
That's right.
I think we could send out announcements to the dentists in the community, and that was it. And I would tell you right now, my practice developed fairly promptly.
Well, I'd like to, just looking at the challenges that the profession is going through, I want to go back and read something that once again that you had as part of a presentation that you gave. I think this was in 1981, and this was before the Future of Dentistry report got started. And in the letter that you're quoting from John Houlihan, the president of the ADA, and it talked about the project to define the scope of the project, establish priorities, coordinate development of the necessary database, project a timetable, and develop a plan of action for the profession. The committee's purpose is to help structure for the Board of Trustees and outline for long-range coordinated plan that has input from the involved communities of interest. And I know that the Future of Dentistry report as sort of came out as a result of that activity. Do you feel that the profession has a plan now with a set of timetables and priorities?
Future of Dentistry recommendations were, I think, 5 in number, perhaps 6. Major one was to stimulate more of the public to avail themselves of dental care. And the ADA developed a marketing system, put a lot of time in it, and I think largely hooked into the television as the media for selling it. And they did some pretty good stuff and tried to sell it to the ADA delegates, but the delegates wouldn't buy in. There would be an assessment, a fair amount of money was hooked into it. But since that time, a number of states I know have either purchased the program or developed their own. California is a good example. Michigan has been very active in it. Those are the two I know about. No question, I think it's done a reasonably good job of stimulating the public to become more interested in dentistry. So I would say that piece of the Future of Dentistry project is probably moving along at perhaps a modest pace. I think much more could be done. One of the recommendations was that dentists should be more market-oriented themselves. And I think many of the schools have been helping to prepare their graduates to be more market-oriented. We've done that. We have very intentionally stayed away from the advertising part of that because it's fraught with all sorts of problems. But I think that's moving along. A third recommendation was to take a hard look at numbers that schools were producing. And very clearly, schools are producing far fewer dentists than they did back in 1982, and the trend would indicate that in another 10 years, we probably will be in fairly near balance. So there are 3 things that are happening. I think another recommendation was develop a 5th year somehow so that all graduates would have an opportunity for a year of residency to better prepare them to bridge the gap. That's not happening, and for good reasons. I think the cost of dental education is certainly a deterrent there, and students who are pretty well in hock for their education are not interested in another year of going in hock, so I don't think that's going to happen for a while. Then another one was to stimulate the research effort, and of course we sort of do that all the time, but that's not moving very rapidly given the restraints at the federal level. So I'd say parts of it are happening and parts of it are not happening. One other was to broaden the skills of dentists, and I think very clearly that's happening. No question about it, but it was happening before the Future of Dentistry report too. I think the report sort of picked up on what we saw is already happening and saying to the dental community generally, well, you ought to expand your horizons, you ought to be doing more things than simply restorative dentistry, and very clearly that's happening, and I think that's been happening at a very rapid rate. So yeah, I think a fair amount of that future study is really perking along quite well now. And I think, again, to the advantage of the public. Oh, I think the quality of the care the public is getting today is just so enormously better. And at the same time, I think it's making the profession much more attractive to the dentist because he has so many more things intellectually and skill-wise that he has to do today. I wish I were starting dentistry today rather than 40 years ago. I think it's a marvelous profession and one that will continue to grow and be very successful. And it's going through some growing pains right now, but it's going to be all right.
I've heard that before, and in fact, speaking to Dr. Roop just a while ago, said exactly the same thing. Wished he could start dentistry today.
Absolutely.
Why have we been so unsuccessful in convincing young people of exactly that thing?
Well, you know, when the Future of Dentistry project got started, there was a group of Texas dentists who were concerned about the large number of dentists graduating in the great state of Texas. And they went to the ADA and said, hey, ADA, you got to do something. So the ADA and the AADS got together in Washington back around, I think, 1980, 81. It was about the time you mentioned with Dr. Houlihan. And that's what sort of got the Future of Dentistry project started. But it was all over numbers. That whole project got started over numbers of dentists. And I think some real concerns, and some of them legitimate, some of them not so legitimate. But I think that we've shot ourselves in the foot all too often. And I think it's many dentists who have turned off the bright young people, turned them away from dentistry. And there are many physicians who are telling their children, don't go into medicine. It's not like it was when I started. You won't like it. Well, I think that's hogwash. It's different. But in many ways, it's probably going to be better. But I think the profession, in a large way, has been responsible for many of the negative feelings about dentistry. With all the lawyers in this country, do you hear lawyers going around talking to young people about don't go into law, you won't like it? I don't really hear much of that except in medicine and dentistry today, and I think dentistry perhaps more than medicine.
And yet at the same time, you hear dentists talk about the financial impact of the competition, that things aren't as easy to get a practice started. Students are coming out with large debts. The concern as to whether or not they'll ever make those debts back, or whether the investment they're making in that length of time for training is going to be paid back.
That's another factor. No question about it. The rate of return for a dental education is much less than it was 15 years ago. In early 1970s, I think a dentist could realize over a lifetime 25% higher income over someone with a baccalaureate degree. And the last accounting I saw of that rate of return, it's now more in the 15 to 17% range. So that has dropped. And statistically, the economists tell us that the applicants to dental school will vary according to the rate of return. And as the rate of return goes up, the applicant pool goes up. As it goes down, the applicant pool goes down. So no question, there's a financial consideration here too. But I just don't think we've done a good enough job of selling, and I hope the SELECT program will help that. That's part of it. That's part of it. I would also say that the public media portrayal of dentistry and where dentistry is going, and it's drawn in large measure on what dentists have been telling the media, have had a negative effect on young people. Harper's perhaps was one of the early ones, but there have been others that have come down the line. And the New York Times has not exactly portrayed dentistry as a place you want to stake your future. But now I look at the young people who've got an engineering degree, perhaps a degree in geology, and have gone into the oil business, and all of a sudden, no jobs. I look at my friends who have been in the oil business and either had to transfer someplace or be without a job. I look at dentists in 1988 who, with some exceptions, can determine sort of where they'd like to go, and I think most of them are going to be very successful. It's still a marvelous profession, but we've really not sung the song as well as I think we should sing it. I have felt for years that the American Dental Association has got to be the salesman for dentistry. It's got to be out there, you know, speaking for it and telling the world how good it is and what marvelous opportunities there are. They've not done that particularly well, in my opinion. The AADS has tried to move into the recruitment area, but not from a, I guess, a public posture point of view, and hopefully the SELECT program will take us someplace together. But I think there's an enormous amount of misinformation about dentistry in the eyes of the public today. I don't think the average person on the street has the faintest idea what dentistry is really about, what it can do for them, how much happier, healthier, and better looking they will be if they avail themselves. We just haven't sung the song that well yet. Seems to me we're still sort of in the back corner trying to scrap our way out. And that's something that I felt really should be the responsibility of organized dentistry, and it's not really happening in my judgment. So it's a combination. And I think the applicant pool is going to be depressed for several years yet, and maybe it'll be that rate of return that will turn it around. There's nothing wrong with earning a good living.
Well, I want to move away from that for just a little while and start to take a look now in terms of Bill Brown's role in this whole process, and start to talk to you a little more personally about what you've done. But this will be really a good point for us to maybe take a little break and stop, and we can kind of get into that.
Fair enough.
Okay? Bill, we've talked for the last while about what's happening in dental education and your views about it, and I'd like to see if we can turn now to looking at your role within that piece of history that's led up to now. As you reflect back on your role in dentistry, what do you track as the people who've influenced you and who've set your direction?
I suspect my father was the first one. He was a marvelous role model. He went to dental school a little bit later, practiced in a small community, and became a city councilman, eventually mayor, very community-oriented person. Spent a lot of time with his family, so, you know, I got to know him very well, and then practiced with him a couple of summers after I graduated from dental school and found out what kind of a quality person he was.
Give me some years and places on this.
Years and places. He started practicing dentistry in 1913. I came along in 1922. I graduated from dental school in 1945.
And the place is?
The place is Benton Harbor, Michigan, right across the lake from Chicago. Fascinating years, a town that's disappeared almost today. Sort of a tragic story. Anyway, he was perhaps the first one. Probably the only one really until I went to dental school. In dental school,
before we leave that, was there any doubt in your mind about going to dental school?
Never. No, and I can't tell you why there wasn't, but it was just always something I was going to do. And I guess it was because the kind of a life that he led and the kind of a person he was, a man with great integrity. I really cared for people. We grew up, our grade school and high school years spanned the 30s when it was pretty tough going, and I recall he would bring farm produce home instead of money many times, but we never knew that a depression was going on. It was just a natural thing for me to do because it was a good life, and I admired what he was and what he did. And I'm not sure he and I ever even talked about it, but it was the natural thing to do. And of course, going to Michigan was a natural thing for me to do too.
Let's go back just once again. What was his sense about dentistry, and what kind of things about dentistry did he convey to you?
I don't think we talked about it very much in my growing up years. I'd piddle around in his laboratory a little bit, but I never really observed what he did with patients. I observed generally his relationships with people, but I don't think there was probably a great deal of discussion about what dentistry was at that time or where it was going. He became involved in the Michigan Dental Association, I think was president of it in 1927. I don't think he played an active role in the advertising issue during the 30s, but I know that he was very close to a number of the people who did. So he was involved in it. I imagine that was about the biggest issue probably that took place at that time. But there was no question about any of the issues that we've been talking about today.
Did he continue to practice when he was a mayor?
Oh yes, very active, very. And his week was, I imagine, Monday through Saturday noon with Wednesday afternoon off for golf. And he always walked to the office. It must have been 8 or 10 blocks, and he'd practice from usually 8 to 6. Hard-working guy.
And when he was mayor, was he able to do that and practice at the same time?
Oh, sure. It was a city manager type of city governance, so he didn't have to spend a lot of time. I think he made $300 a year as mayor, and the city manager looked after things, and he just kissed the Peach Queen or whatever else and conducted city council meetings, so it was not heavy duty.
Well, that was, and served in lots of ways as a leader of dentistry in Michigan.
No question about it. Sure. So I sense that, you know, some of my interest in leadership probably came from him, but he was somebody who really looked after people. I think money was of relatively little importance to him. He did fine, but that wasn't something that he spent a lot of time worrying about.
And his first name?
Same as mine.
Oh, this is.
I dropped the junior some years ago because it got in the way.
Okay. And dental school now. University of Michigan.
University of Michigan. Started in 1942. One of the regrets has always been that I had 2 years of liberal arts education, then went directly into dental school. It was a 3-year program during the war days. So I graduated with a dental degree in 5 years after high school. And I've always felt shortchanged with my college education, but that's the way it sort of was at that time. Military was very much interested in getting us in and getting us going and getting us through school. So I went through dental school in 3 years, and it was not that difficult because there wasn't all that much information back in those days. But dental school years were basically pleasant years. Antiquated equipment, but we didn't know any better, happily, in those days. We were in the service. I think almost all of us were in the service for a good portion of our dental school days until the war wound down, and then we were discharged, and they didn't need us again until the Korean War. But it was a rich experience, but again, pretty archaic education by today's standards. Very few full-time faculty, long waits in the clinic as I remember, very strict discipline, pretty uncomfortable as I remember. The dean and I were good friends, but I remember a couple of incidents that I got so upset with him. I'll give you one, sort of fun.
The dean is?
The dean at that time was a guy named Russell Bunting, known as one of the world's early periodontists, and also did some research on dental caries. I was sitting in class one day, and the guy next to me was talking. I finally turned to him and said, "Shut up." That was the only thing the dean heard. He was teaching the class. So he reprimanded me in front of the entire class, which was very disconcerting. One other occasion, I was working in the lab at night in the summer. No air conditioning, hotter than the day. We all worked in T-shirts, which they didn't look too bad, but I made the mistake of going into the library for a book one night in my T-shirt, and the dean was there in the evening. He caught me. He said, "I don't want to ever see you in this library in your undershirt again." So those are the two things I remember most about the dean at that time.
But you also got to be close friends with him.
We were pretty good friends, and he and my father were pretty good friends. Sure. He was a fine man and did some good things. Sure.
Any pieces of that dental school that you remember in terms of influencing what you finally decided to do with your career?
Well, dental school was 2 years of basic sciences and 2 years of clinical sciences. We never saw the clinic until we were juniors, and that was too bad. The basic sciences were pretty well isolated from the mainstream in those days. Most of it was serendipity, what happened. I was going into service after graduation, but the pedodontic department, so named at that time, said, "Hey, we need part-time instructor, and we'll help you go to graduate school at the same time." So I talked to a lot of people and looked as though that was a reasonable future, so I went into graduate school and was a part-time instructor in the pedodontic department. And the chairman of the department was a guy named Kenneth Eastlick, and he and I became very close friends. He is probably the person in dental school who influenced me more than anybody else. He was an old English teacher. He was an old maid about writing, and we had to do a great deal of writing and searching the literature, and he was a very good critic. He would go through every paper we wrote, and we wrote many, with a red pencil. And he became known through the years as that person with the red pencil. But he probably taught me more about writing and scientific writing than anybody else, and it was a great learning experience for me. He was a well-prepared teacher. He was a very reasonable clinician, and even in his later years, probably about my age when I recall it, he would still be working in the clinic teaching young dental students how to do it in those days, but he had a great influence on me. He would be the single person, I guess, during those dental school years and during my graduate years who had the greatest influence.
And track it along now. Did you think at that time that you were going to be heading for a career in dental education?
No, not at all. I started a pediatric dental practice in Campus Town, just 3 or 4 blocks from the dental school, and started practice like so many other people. And I was debt-free. Tuition when I went through dental school was $120 a year. We had instruments loaned to us. And I think we paid $25 a year for the privilege of renting the instruments, and if we lost or broke any, they'd punch the little card we had to take off so much. But I was debt-free, bought some equipment, paid cash for it, shared an office. Overhead was probably 35%. My partner and I taught part-time, and he was teaching when I was in the office and vice versa, so we were rarely there together, which made it work out very, very nicely. So I didn't worry that much about getting started in a hurry, and didn't have any indebtedness at all. So it was a very nice way to get started. And as I recall, I got started faster than I had expected, and perhaps couldn't do some of the things that I would have liked to do in terms of learning a little bit more and preparing myself just a little bit better. But I've been in practice, I think, 5 years or less, and I just couldn't see any more patients. And I was practicing mornings and Saturday afternoons, and I was teaching the reverse of that. So I was teaching 6 half-days, practicing 6 half-days, and during the vacation and summer months I would basically practice 5 or 6 days a week, and I was often back in the office on Sundays. The part-time teaching, back in those days, it included Saturday morning. And I was in student contact. Maybe some of our faculty should hear this story someday, but I was in student contact in the clinic primarily, 6 half-days a week. My paycheck, as I recall, was something like $4,000 a year. But I sort of liked what I was doing, but again, I didn't have any particular interest in becoming a full-time educator. For whatever reasons, I got involved very early in organizational activities. I don't know, I guess I was president of the local dental society, and then got hooked into the American Society of Dentistry for Children, then the Academy, then the board, then the Michigan Dental Association. I went through a number of chairs very early in my 30s. And I've wondered many times how that happened to me. And to this very fine moment, I'm not really quite sure why it did, but it did, and it was a rich experience for me. But then I got to a point in my career where I really was pretty well burned out. 6 days a week, often 7. I did that for roughly a dozen years with a fairly young family, and Sundays were the day I had with my family, and basically it was a day for me to recover so I could start doing the darn thing all over again come Monday morning. Usually start at 7:30 in the morning and be in the office till 1:45, 15 minutes for lunch, up at school at 1 o'clock, back to the office at 5:15 for an hour or so, back home. And Saturdays we finished up in the office about 6 o'clock. So it was heavy duty in those days, and I frankly wore out. And I decided I had 2 full-time jobs working, and I would have to make a decision sometime which way I wanted to go. I enjoyed being at the school. It had certain freedoms, and I guess the clock wasn't ticking quite as fast as at the school as it was in my office, because we operated very close to the clock, and it was pretty stress-laden in those days. And then I had an opportunity to become a full-time faculty person, which I decided to do, but it meant giving up my practice totally, because Michigan in those days, if you were a full-time faculty person, I believe even today, you were not permitted to have an outside practice, nor was there even an intramural practice in those days. So my salary dropped off pretty drastically, pretty rapidly, and our lifestyle changed somewhat, but it did tend to take, I had a steam off me.
Now, how old were you at that point?
That would have been 1962, and I would have been 40 at that point.
So at age 40, you sold the practice, or gave up the practice, and went into full-time teaching of pedodontics.
Actually, I was 2/3 administration. I was an assistant dean largely for graduate and postgraduate education, and pedagogtic teaching was sort of incidental to what I was doing. And I did that for 7 years, but to be honest about it, it got pretty boring. I was doing much of the same old thing. I was responsible for continuing education and sort of the paperwork for the graduate programs, and like many assistant deans, a lot of responsibilities with zero authority. And I was a younger person, and there were a lot of older faculty there who I grew up with, and it was difficult to make the system move very much at that time. All sorts of grand plans, and then we'd sit down and talk about them, and somehow things didn't seem to happen very quickly. So I thought maybe there was a different way to go. So I was just frankly, I guess, bored and looking for something else at that time without quite knowing where it was going to take me.
And what happened?
What happened? Had a dear colleague, I think he's still alive today, who was president of the American Dental Association. And they were looking for a replacement for Harold Hillenbrand. This was about 1968, and he said, "Why don't you be a candidate?" I thought, sure, why not?
Okay, so right now you're full-time at Michigan, assistant dean, assistant associate professor. And someone says, "Why don't you become executive director of the ADA?"
Yes. And, you know, I'd worked with Harold very closely, and I'd been heavily involved in the American Dental Association. I'd been a delegate for a number of years and participated in some very heavy projects of the American Dental Association. And as we talked about earlier, the Hillenbrand years were good years, lots happening, very exciting. And I thought, oh, not bad. Why don't I be a candidate for his job? And I was. And I was one of the finalists, and Gordon Watson got the position. And yes, I was disappointed at the time. I learned very quickly that I really didn't know very much about dental politics, because the decision was made based on who was going to be president of the ADA, and if you vote for him, I'll vote for you, and you vote for me to be president. So there was some vote swapping, and things were not really quite what I expected them to be. And then Oklahoma was looking for someone to start a new dental school almost at the same time, fairly soon after that. And I came down here, and I'm sure knowing relatively little about what it would take to really get the job done, I finally bought into it and came here in 1969 and went from there.
How big a role did Harold Hillenbrand play in choosing the successor?
He was a strong supporter for me, and he thought he had it all wired, but I guess that was the change in the system. That sent out a signal, but no longer would the executive director call the signals. Yeah, he thought he had it all set to go, but overnight there was a 2-vote switch, and that's just what it took, and that's what made the difference. Oh yeah, he thought he had it all worked out.
Any regrets or ideas as to what might have been different if you had gotten that position?
Frankly, I don't think I would have lasted very long in that position. I think I would have fallen into the same problems that Gordon Watson did, because the trustees basically took the leadership away from the executive director at that time. And I would hate to call any of those marvelous people office boys, but compared to what Harold was able to do in his years, that's basically what they became. And my sense is that I probably wouldn't have been much different than that, and would have become rather dissatisfied within a short period of time and checked out or get fired. No, I've had no regrets after the initial, I can't believe they didn't select me. But very briefly, that passed in a hurry. Oh, I wouldn't have traded for the last 18 years in Oklahoma. Marvelous learning experience.
Well, and you put a sort of a cryptic sentence in a letter that you wrote me in 1986 when we were talking about the potential of this interview. You were sort of going through the kind of things that happened to you in your professional career, and it says, came to Oklahoma in 1969 to start a dental school. It happened and it probably will survive, but there were many sharp curves in the road. What was that about?
What were the sharp curves in the road? Oh my, were there ever sharp curves in the road? And some square corners too. I had had experience at a very mature, sophisticated university, very well-known, very sophisticated institution. Their management systems were well in place. And I came to the Health Sciences Center in Oklahoma City, which is separate from the main campus, and learned very quickly that management systems really didn't exist at all. Personnel management, budgeting, accounting, whatever. They weren't here. The checks and the balances didn't exist. And I'd been here a couple of months, and I honestly asked myself whether or not I'd walked into a big mess. And frankly, I had walked into a big mess. When I had the sense to look at what the College of Medicine's budget was, I realized that it was so low that even a much smaller dental school couldn't come close to operate with the kind of money the College of Medicine was making. So there were some rather scary times. I had to deal with a vice president for health affairs who was a marvelous person and was the planner of the campus, Jim Dennis, and I wouldn't trade for him. And Herb Holloman, who was the president of the university at that time. Herb was an extremely intelligent person, very student-oriented person, and it was sort of the end of that student activist period. And he would more often than not side with the students, and this created some problems for some of the more conservative individuals, including the governor of the state. And so the president got in trouble with the governor. He and Jim Dennis did not see eye to eye on many issues, and there was a great deal that got in the press between Jim and Herb, and it got to be pretty naughty. And the short of it was that both Jim and Herb left within about a year of my coming. So two people who had recruited me, who were largely responsible for the development of this campus, now were gone. So that was a very sharp curve in the road, because the successor to Dennis and the successor to Holloman, there were a number of successors. Another sharp curve was the Chancellor's office, the State Chancellor for Higher Education. That's a coordinating board that coordinates all of higher education in the state of Oklahoma. And it receives the lump sum budget for higher education from the legislature, then it allocates it out. And it was a system that I was not used to, but it was a system that was very potent, very political, and one that I found rather uncomfortable. And the cost of developing a dental school was an awful lot more in the early 1970s than the cost estimates back in the 1950s.
And the building wasn't built yet.
The building wasn't built yet, and I didn't know that we'd ever get money. Jim Dennis, I think one of the very finest things he did, he was instrumental in getting the state to agree to an almost $100 million bond issue for capital development of higher education. And out of that $100 million was 27 or 28 million for the Health Sciences Center. And there was still federal construction money at that time, and it was basically a 2-to-1 match, federal to state. The state had the money in the bank, and now the big objective was to get federal grants to build our facilities. And that was anything but simple. We were able to get funding for a third-floor addition of the basic science building, and we were writing grants madly. There were 3 of us basically writing the grants and doing all the planning at that time. And we developed a grant application for our clinic building. And then the feds decided that the rules had changed, so everybody had to resubmit. I think the Environmental Protection Agency got into it at that time. So you had to include an environmental impact statement, and it was quite different. So we were delayed a year. We were going to start the school 2 years after I came, and that would have been an all-time record. And I think had it not been for that delay of federal funding, we probably would have done it. But we started it within 3 years, which was as good as anybody else had done it and better than most. But getting the funding for that dental clinical sciences building was a real trick. We had a good application. The priorities were good because of the manpower, the relatively poor manpower position that Oklahoma was in compared to other states, and the great need down here. But the campus was trying to get federal funding for a dental building, a biomedical sciences building, and a library. And I recall that the architect and a few of us went to Washington to talk to HEW staff one time about strategy, and staff said, well, with a little bit of luck you can get one building, but beyond that you don't have a prayer. Well, we came back, decided to scrub the library, but the biomedical sciences building was crucial to the dental school, and we had a pretty big piece of it, so we decided to go for both of them. And I don't know whether we got some political help, nobody's ever said, and I guess I never asked the question, but Carl Albert was Speaker of the House at that time. Dean McGee, who has been a very large person in Oklahoma for years, I think had plenty of influence in Washington, and I'm sure we got some at least peripheral help. But anyway, we got both those buildings funded, and that sent us on our way, and we got all the money that we asked for. And then when we bid the building, the dental building, the bids came in well under budget, and we were able to do some things that we hadn't planned on. It's beautifully equipped, and in my opinion, probably as handsome a dental building and functionally as good a building as exists any place in the world today. But that was a real crisis time, because if we didn't get it, there was no way to get all the money to build the building from state sources alone. Then during this period, this would have been the period 1970-72 when the grant applications were flowing. We're recruiting faculty. If we're going to get started in 1972, we've got to have a few faculty around. So now we're recruiting faculty, not certain whether we're going to get buildings funded, not really certain whether the state's going to provide operating dollars that will permit us to operate reasonably. So we're inviting recruits down here and telling them we're not quite sure whether we're really going to get this thing cranked up, but come on, take a chance with us.
That's right. You still want a job.
Still want a job. So anyway, it worked out well, but there were a lot of curves at that time. Dentists in the state, the dentists were very helpful to us. I had met with them early and stayed with them very closely, especially in the early years, and very supportive people, and it was a very rich opportunity. But some of those curves reappeared 1972-73 when the governor's office and the legislature investigated our campus. And
72-73.
Yep, and this was just at the time we'd taken our first dental class. The issues at that time had to do, as you can well imagine, with money. Here the campus, the university's building all these marvelous buildings, and somebody finally figured out it was going to take a lot more money to make them operate, even though we got the capital money, and they weren't too sure they liked that. And then the campus got in terrible money troubles, largely because of the hospitals. The physician's practice plan was under much scrutiny, and we were really under the gun. And I can recall hearing at one time somebody saying, we're not going to let those people build any more buildings. And I think that was at the time when our dental clinical building was in the grant review process. So it was scary times. And it cost the job of our vice president for health affairs at that time. He was summarily told to look elsewhere. Dean of Public Health got fired. Public Health and Allied Health were consolidated into one college. And I was given the rare opportunity to serve as the provost. It was then called the acting provost for our campus. And I did that for a couple of years, and that period was full of curves.
In the early 70s?
That would have been 1973-75. We're 1 year into our dental program. Our dental building has been funded, and we're now starting to build the building. So I was running that while doing all the other things at the same time. Very exciting period.
What's your sense? I know that the issue has come up more recently in terms of the future of the school. Has there been an ambivalence of the government of Oklahoma towards the dental school?
I don't think so. I can't tell you for sure why the governor recommended in January of 1987 that our school should be closed, but I've just got enough bits and pieces so I feel fairly comfortable that that recommendation was stimulated, number one, by a bad economy, and he felt he could save some money by closing it, and secondly, by a relatively small group of dentists who went to the governor and said, we've got too many dentists in the state, having the school here is hurting us, hurting our practices, and Mr. Governor, you've got a bad money problem, save yourself some money and send them out of state. I think that's probably what happened. And I've heard it from enough different quarters right now to probably assume that that's pretty close to the truth. There had never been a study of our school. We had some problems, especially with a very small number of dentists whose patients eventually got to some of our faculty. And in one case in particular, a patient had to be retreated, and that dentist was very upset about it, and spent quite a lot of time on our campus looking into budget and making life, frankly, quite unpleasant for us. And I think probably along with a few other people, that got things started. And if you really cut through the fuzz, and if you really could ever put it up on the tabletop, it becomes almost an ethical issue of patient care. And, you know, every time we got a patient from the practicing community who needed our help, it put us at risk. And even today, I know faculty, we talk about these things all the time. Should we handle Mrs. Jones because she was treated by so-and-so and there are bad feelings there? And if we look after her now, we've got yet another enemy in the system. And I think that was really the heart of it. And I don't fault the governor for that. He was in a very difficult position at that time. And when he did it, it just seemed that a lot of people sort of jumped on the bandwagon and said, yeah, hey, that's a good idea. Shut that thing down, we'll send them out. And in fact, we had a couple other schools that just jumped on our applicants almost immediately to take them away from us. And we had to do a fair amount of scurrying around a year ago to keep some of the piranhas off our back. I was very disappointed in some of my educational colleagues for their behavior at the time.
Is that right?
You bet.
You mean in terms of the announcement and them trying to...
Yeah, our school had not been closed. The governor just said he was going to recommend it to the legislature. And nothing had happened. It was just a governor's announcement. But all of a sudden, one school in particular just jumped on our applicants and said, we understand the school is closing. You certainly don't want to go there. Come join us. Very unpleasant.
What's your feeling about the future of dental education in Oklahoma? Is it secure?
I think it's very secure. In fact, I thought it was secure when the governor made his recommendation. Because, you know, you've got to assess the whole thing. You've got to look at the quality of the program, how much it's going to cost, and then you make a policy decision on the worth of it. Is it worth it to the taxpayers of the state? And we found we had an awful lot of friends very quickly. And we spent many hours with the legislature, and we found very few who would not make a very strong commitment to us. And we found a number who'd been patients of ours. We found a great number of advocates up there. And the Dental Association did not immediately jump to our support for many different reasons, and I don't particularly fault them for that, except I was disappointed in that because I thought we were part of the brotherhood, and, you know, we'd come to their rescue. I came to their personal rescue on numbers of occasions, and I expected they would come to our rescue, but that did not happen immediately. And sort of a bizarre set of circumstances, probably not worth talking about, but we had, I don't think, done as good a job communicating with them as we should have. We'd put stuff in the journal, we'd talk about numbers, but one example, I had made a commitment to them that we were going to reduce our class size from 72 to 50. And I had worked that out with our provost at that time, and he thought that was a good idea. Then he had a second thought. He said, oh, I'm not sure we ought to drop it that quickly. So we decided we'd only drop it to 60 that first year. So we went from 72 to 60, but because we didn't go to 50 immediately, I got a lot of flack over that. And it was pretty well beyond anything I could do about it. Thereafter, we moved down to 50 just as quickly as we could. But I recall at a meeting of the local dental society last spring after the governor had come out, a person I knew very well, when we told them that we had been taking 50 or 52 or 3 for several years, he said, my God, I thought you people were still taking 72 students. That had been in print all over the place, so there were lots of misunderstandings. The economy was lousy. Lots of reasons why I think dentists didn't immediately jump to our support. The president of the Dental Association died, and a very strong supporter of ours, and really couldn't get in and help us as much as he might. And it was an uncomfortable period for us. Dental hygiene issue was still alive at that time, and since our hygiene faculty had taken a position supporting new legislation, we paid a price for that one. And I debated you know, when they did it, First Amendment, freedom of speech versus, well, this is going to create some political problems for us, and I guess I went with the Constitution of the United States. But clearly in the last year or so, we've stayed out of that fray totally, in our dental hygiene people too, and we should not be involved in that kind of political battle, I'm sure, but that created some real problems for us. But I think the future of dentistry in Oklahoma and our school, yeah, I think it's very secure. We've reduced numbers, and I think it's to a reasonable number. The net increase in the number of dentists in Oklahoma over the last 5 or 6 years, net increase, is about 32. Very small number. And the numbers who leave practice annually, who retire from practice, roughly it's about 45 if we interpolate the medical physician data, and I think it's probably pretty close. And with some of the other educational programs in Oklahoma, unfortunately, there are more and more graduates who are leaving the state. Oklahomans who have gone to school here who are leaving the state. Pharmacy is a primary example from that. They can go to Dallas and realize a marked increase in income. Graduates of the College of Education, seems to me I saw recently 2/3, maybe 80% of them are looking for positions in other states. But the dental school here is a very sound one. I think it has a good core of support. The Dental Association and the school today are working very closely together. Last summer, several of us made visitations to dental societies around the state, visited offices, had lunch, and the current dean is doing that, I think, on a pretty regular basis. So we have a core of support now that I think will survive probably anything that could happen.
What, as you look back on the 19 years as dean here, is there anything that you would have done differently?
Not significantly differently. I've been in dental organizations almost all of my life, and I guess I pretty well wore out of partying with dentists, and maybe that was something I should have done different. But I'd reached a point where it was hard for me to be out late at night, to socialize perhaps the way some of them would have wished me to socialize. But you know, for the first 10 years I was here, it was a 7-day week, and it was probably 14 to 16 hours a day, and I probably wore out. And so my leaving, I think, was a good thing, because now there's fresh blood that can perhaps participate in the social aspects of being part of the larger community. And I think probably that's a good thing. I probably would have done that differently if I'd had the stamina to do it, but I intellectually and physically wore out. Other than that, I don't think I would have done things much differently. The curriculum, I don't think I would change that. The quality of the faculty that we have is just unusually fine. I made a few mistakes there, and I sort of knew it at the time. But the marketplace for faculty during the 70s was very tight. New schools, many schools expanding, and the pool of available faculty was relatively small. But the mistakes I made are more than counterbalanced by the marvelous people, and most of the chairs are still here.
Tell me about the decisions to step down as dean. What went into that?
I'd done all I could do. The governor's thing last year, the recommendation to close, was sort of in a sense, a neat thing for me, because it gave me one more shot, one more thing to do. And I worked very hard at that. And I wasn't sure I was going to have fun walking the halls of the legislature. That really was not part of my experience, but I found once I got into it, it was pretty good. Found some marvelous people out there, and I'm a pretty big supporter of the Oklahoma legislature now. There are a lot of good folks there who really try to work the system. That gave me sort of a new juice, but I was going to step down within a year or two, and the retirement law changed and made it almost, I guess, folly on my part not to step down when I did, and it was time. It was time. I think the next dean will be there for a much shorter period than I, and I think that's going to be typical of administrations pretty much around the country in the next decade or two. Going to be much shorter terms.
No more 19-year deans?
I doubt it. I think that's historical. No, I don't think that's going to be part of the system again.
Bill, look back for me now, and if you were to look back at your professional career, what would you count among the accomplishments you're most proud of?
I did some things for the organization that I would say relatively few people have done. We did some things in Michigan at the time that really were pretty striking. We developed a children's program, 3 of us, that became the ADA's children's program, and it was Not adopted without a great deal of debate back in the mid-60s, but eventually it was adopted, and in fact became adopted by the Congress. Never got funded, but it was pretty far-reaching kind of thing. It was, I think, one of dentistry's better efforts to really try to look after society. That was a good one. That was a good one. Educationally, I've played a major role, I think, in improving the system nationally. I was a member of the Commission on Dental Accreditation for 8 years, and I'd been a consultant for 10 or 15 years before that, and I've seen the educational system nationally improve just incredibly, and a lot of it took place during my tenure on the Commission. Standards for accreditation are much higher than they used to be. Schools are doing an infinitely better job. I suppose I've had as much to do with curricula as anybody, and I think they've improved enormously. And then, you know, putting together a school basically from scratch with a fair number of things that could have stopped it. Not bad.
So here you are, you're 67, and I was looking at
No, I'm 65.
65,
You got your
sorry.
dates wrong. That's all right. That gets pretty critical at this time.
Yes, right. We count those years.
Absolutely.
I was looking at some life expectancy tables, and people at 65, on the average, can expect to live another 14 to 16 years. What is Bill Brown going to be doing now for the...
I'm expecting at least 20.
Okay.
Yeah, at least 20.
All right.
That really hasn't shaken out yet. One of the things, though, that has become very obvious to me in the few months I have been pretty much on my own is that life is a lot broader than dental education. I've become an avid reader, and I read at least a book a week, and some books that I've wanted to read and never really got around to it. That perhaps has been the greatest joy. I spend a modest amount of time with the local chapter of the Red Cross, and we'll get into that more and more as a volunteer type person. I've been back at the school or talked to somebody there probably on a weekly basis to help in the transition. We'll do anything I can to be helpful to them. But I basically will move more and more away, I think, from dentistry generally and do something totally different. I've worked myself into probably better physical shape than I've been in the last 30 years or so, and I feel good about that. And I will continue to do that. I've reestablished tennis singles, which I haven't played in 20 years, and I find I can still do that, and that's sort of fun. People say, aren't you going to travel a lot? And my answer is probably not so much, because I've done most of that throughout my earlier years. It's not that appealing to me. I'll do some of that, but I'm going to find my way. And I'm not going to make any commitments. I find that with all the chores now, it's pretty hard to get things working until 10 or 11 in the morning. I don't know how I ever got there at 7 or 7:30 before. Life is just not meant to be like that. So I'm going to take it as it comes right now and try to do something totally different. But this broadening of interests, more time with good music, more time good reading, I missed that as a youngster growing up, and I missed it in college, and so I'm going to recapture it now. That's about all I can tell you.
Couldn't read War and Peace now.
I'm in the middle of that one. That's pretty heavy duty. Good book.
Bill, if in winding this up, if you were to try to find some words that would describe who Bill Brown is, what words would you use?
Type A. A drifter in a sense, because I really didn't have my life plotted out. Things just sort of happened. I've got a good history. I've taken on things, and I've normally done them thoroughly and well. I've not disappointed too many people. And to the young coming up through the system, don't be too impatient. You can't be a president of a dental association or a dean of a school just because you want to, or just because you think you deserve it, or just because you think it's your time. You've got to build a history. And if you build a history, those things will come. And if they come, terrific. If they don't come, you've given it your best shot. And I guess, you know, I've had more than my share of plaudits, but you've got to be faithful to yourself. And when the day comes, and you say, I've done all I can do, That's the best way to have it. Enjoy.
That's super.
Sure. That's it.